Alright y'all, welcome back to the channel and to some more slug testing, and today we've got another very interesting combination to try out, and it's one that I honestly don't know what we're gonna see. It could work, it could be absolutely terrible and not work at all, but it's one of those where we really don't know quite what's gonna happen until we actually try it and see. So as for the shells I brought out here today, I got out some of these, the Remington Premier AccuTip Sabot Slugs. These ones are their 20 gauge 2 3/4 inch 260 grain Sabot Slugs, moving about 1850 feet per second. And generally these Remington AccuTip Sabot Slugs are some pretty good performers. We've seen some pretty solid accuracy in them from my 12 gauge 870 with a rifled barrel, but that kind of brings us to today's setup because it's pretty borderline. It might work with these, it might not. And as for that setup, it is this guy, which is my Stevens 301 20 gauge, has a 26-inch barrel on it, but it is a smooth bore. So I have a Carlson's rifled choke tube in the gun. So this is definitely a pretty interesting thought process and combination. We've tried some of the Hornady SST Sabot Slugs through this exact setup with this rifle choke, and it just wasn't enough rifling to quite stabilize those Sabot rounds. But I have some of these Remington AccuTips as well, which are also a Sabot slug. So can it be enough to stabilize the Remingtons? I don't know. There's a decent chance that they just kind of keyhole down range and we get pretty much nothing out of them, but we'll see. The biggest problem I see here is that these Stevens 301 20 gauges use the standard invector or wind choke threads, and the choke is only about like 2 1/4 inches long or so. So you have a very small amount of rifling to work with, and it might not be enough to stabilize those AccuTip slugs, but we'll see. But as for our test today, we're kind of going to have to play it as it comes. We'll start out at 50 yards and we'll shoot a 3-shot group at 50 and see what happens. If the slugs are kind of keyholing or doing weird things, we may just take another 3-shot group at 50 and call it good there to see what happens. But if they look good, then we'll reach it out to 100 and shoot another group and see what happens. And of course, I do have the chronograph as well so we can get our velocities from the shells. But let's get you guys a view of that 50-yard target and take a couple shots and see just what happens and if that Carlson's rifle choke is enough to actually stabilize these AccuTip Sabot slugs. Alright, so after shooting 3 shots at 50, we hit the paper kind of 1.5 times. Clearly that is a sideways bullet hole, and I think right up here at the very top, we just barely clipped the edge of the paper with another one. And the third shot, I have no idea where it went because it didn't hit the target at all. So I don't usually do this, but since we're kind of all over the place here, and clearly it's not working already, which was my concern coming into it, let's move this target back half the distance from 50 to 25 now, and see what it does at 25 yards. Maybe we might be able to keep all of our shots on the paper when we're at that close range, because I'm just curious to see if they're all directly sideways or what the case is. And I've got 2 more shells left in that particular box, so let's move it back to 25 yards. I adjusted the chronograph a little bit because those velocity readings were all over the place, and we'll take those last 2 shots out of that box and just see what happens. All right, well, 25 definitely told us a little bit more with those last 2 shots, and it pretty much was exactly what I thought it was doing at 50 as well. So at 50, we had this guy up here, and I believe this tiny little nick was also 1 shot, and seeing these 2 pretty much touching at 25 tells me that our other 2 rounds were probably right up here somewhere just off the top edge of the paper. Obviously, my gun is not zeroed for these, and they are a pretty hot loading, so we were hitting a little high even at 50 yards. But as we can see, every bullet hole in the paper is perfectly sideways, definitely not stable whatsoever. And that's kind of what I wanted to see coming into it, was is that rifle choke enough to stabilize these Remington Sabot slugs? We saw pretty much the same thing with the Hornady SSTs, so it really isn't too big of a surprise. Now in a 12 gauge that might have a little bit longer of a choke, a Sabot slug might do just fine through a rifle choke. Seems like the standard invector slash wind choke type of system in 20 gauge is not enough enough rifling to stabilize the Sabot Slug. I mean, I'll measure those two 25-yard shots just to see how close they were together, but ultimately, I wouldn't use this for a hunting scenario at all, even though they are pretty much touching at closer ranges. A bullet flying sideways is not going to perform the same as a bullet flying straight when it actually impacts that animal. So I'll measure it and give you guys the numbers, but definitely not something I would want to use on a hunt. So those two 25-yard shots are 0.92 inches apart, and that is pretty much from center to center on those two bullet holes right there. But ultimately, I've heard it kind of go both ways, where some people see that a rifle choke is good enough for Sabots, others don't, and I kind of wanted to test that with the Sabot Slugs I did have for 20 gauge and see what would happen. For today, doesn't seem like the Carlson's rifle choke with these Remington AccuTips is a good combination. So I guess let's go peek at our chronograph numbers to at least see what kind of velocity we were moving. Alright, so let's peek at our chronograph here real quick. And those first three shots at 50 yards were definitely all over the place as far as readings go. Sabot Slugs can be tricky through a chronograph. You got to get them just right as far as distance from the end of the muzzle to the beginning of the chronograph. So I made some adjustments. Clearly those 3,000 and 2,800 and stuff like that was wrong. And we did get our last two shots there, which I do believe was correct. The boss claim was 1850 and we had 1,932 and 1,880, which gave us an average right at 1906, so that's 56 feet per second above the boss claim. And of course, here's your energy number and stuff for 1906 feet per second with a 260 grain slug. We've got good energy, but clearly they're just not going to work out of a rifled choke, at least in my setup. But if nothing else, we were seeing a little more than the box claimed velocity, which is definitely a pretty nice thing to see sometimes. And here are a couple of the sabots out of that slug, and they definitely opened up pretty well perfectly flat here. You can see we had a little bit of rifle engagement down towards the base there, but definitely nothing even close to what we would have from a fully rifled barrel, so it's just not enough rifling in that choke, I don't think. Plus, we had a couple sabots down there that looked like this, where they just kind of tore apart. So definitely a little bit interesting, and I really don't know why these would have a reason to tear apart like that with that short of rifling. Maybe it has something to do with the speed they're traveling at, jamming into the rifling right at the tip of the barrel like that and just kind of pulling them apart. But I don't know. Definitely some pretty inconsistent results here from the sabots, but I think the ultimate concern here is just not enough rifling with the choke. Alright, y'all. Well, what do you think about those results right there? It's a little bit of a jumbled test, I know, but we kind of didn't know what we were going to see until we came into it and actually tried it. I had some suspicions that it wasn't really going to work or stabilize it, just based on the previous Hornady SST test we did with this exact same combination, and we pretty well saw the exact same results. I just don't think, at least not in the wind choke system, that we have enough rifling to actually stabilize the slugs properly. But that's why we test things, because you never know what's going to happen until you try it. And some are going to be good, some just aren't going to work at all. And that's pretty well what we saw here today. But at least now we know, and maybe it can save me or you time or money in the future on not even bothering with this combination. So as always, leave your thoughts in the comments. Is that about what you expected to see, or were you surprised one way or the other? Have you tested any Sabot Slugs through a rifle choke? And if so, have you found something that works, or have they all pretty much done the same thing? And is there another slug combo that you want to see us try through that Carlson's rifle choke? I definitely want to run some of your standard lead Foster style rifled slugs through it as well, because that might be the ticket for that choke. But these Sabot Slugs just aren't. So leave all your thoughts about it down in the comments. But with that being said, I've got some more testing to get done for you guys, so I'm going to get back to it. As always, we have the channel Instagram as well as the mailbox where you can send stuff if you'd like. All that information will be in the description if you're interested in it, but I'm going to get back to it, so I'll see y'all in the next one.